Well, good evening, everyone. I believe we are ready to go ahead and start the program for tonight. By way of introduction, my name is Eric Lovestrand, and I work as the IFAS County Extension Director in Franklin County here in the Mid-Florida Panhandle. And I also serve as a regional specialized agent for the Florida Sea Grant Program on coastal and marine topics, and I am based in an office in Apalachicola. I will be introducing our presenters for this evening, but first of all, I wanted to say thank you to those that have joined us tonight. We appreciate the time that you're spending with us, and also we appreciate your interest in learning more about our amazing bay scallops. This program is actually part of a series of webinars that are being conducted along Florida's Gulf Coast throughout the range of the bay scallop. And tonight's target audience was primarily citizens in Wakulla and Franklin County areas. We do have 4 presenters to share information with you tonight on topics related to harvesting areas and rules. We're going to talk some about boating safety and seagrasses, also about bay scallop biology and ecology, and food safety tips even from harvest to dinner plate. I will introduce each speaker as their topic comes up, and presentations will move fairly quickly, so we will have plenty of time for questions and answers. And as you think of questions, please type them into the chat box. There's a button at the bottom of your screen for that, or you can also type them into the Q&A box that we have there. And we do have a moderator for tonight. Mr. Scott Jackson is our County Extension Director over in Bay County. Scott will be reading those questions out after all of the presentations are done so we can answer those. And I am actually going to present first tonight. So I will be talking about the main locations where people from the Wakulla and Franklin County region actually go to scallop and harvest scallops, and also some of the general rules that apply when harvesting bay scallops, both related to the harvest regulations as well as some information about boating and boating safety regulations. So we will go ahead and get started here on this first presentation. Make sure I've got it. There we go. Okay. Again, I'll be talking a little bit about the areas in Wakulla and Franklin where folks from those 2 counties generally go to harvest bay scallops. And then we'll cover some boating safety information and some of the regulations related to harvesting and boating as well. I put a slide in for St. Joseph Bay, even though it's in Gulf County, because there are quite a few people from Wakulla and Franklin County in particular that go over to St. Joseph Bay to scallop, because it is a fairly reliable area for bay scallop harvesting in this region. And several people even travel down from Leon County and other areas, counties around this region to go to St. Joseph Bay. Most of the primary area in the bay where people harvest bay scallops is in the head of the bay at the southern end there, that area that's highlighted in lighter blue. And in particular around a small island called Black's Island. That's an area that a lot of people head to. When you are trying to find a location to actually put in your boat to go to these areas that we'll be talking about tonight, one of the best places to go is the boat ramp finder map that Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission manages. The box in the middle of the screen there, you can see when you click on a boat ramp, it will give you information about the type of ramp, where it's located, access to that ramp if it's on public or private land, and if there's a fee involved for that ramp actually, and the hours of operation. So this is a really helpful tool for finding places to get into the water and get to scallop harvesting areas. These are the primary locations where people from our area put in vessels over in St. Joseph Bay to harvest scallops. But I want you to take note of the red text at the top of this slide. Everywhere that you put in to access scalloping areas is generally going to involve navigating some very shallow seagrass habitat when you get into the harvest area. And on the way there, very likely sandbars or oyster bars are things that you need to be aware of and watching out for when you're navigating on the water. The primary place on St. Joseph Bay where people really like to put in closest to the main scalloping areas is Presnell's Marina. It's a private marina. All of these locations here do have minimal boat launch fees for putting in, and they are very busy during the scallop season. Presnell's actually has folks there on staff that come out and help direct and guide the traffic to get boats launched more effectively. Frank Pate Park is a city park in Port St. Joe, And it is a little farther away from the primary scalping areas at about 6.5 miles that you have to travel down the bay. St. Joseph Peninsula Park is another popular area. There is a park entry fee per vehicle to come into the park, and you can then access the Eagle Harbor boat launch area to put in a vessel there. It basically just reopened recently as of June 10th, 2020, on a limited basis following damage from Hurricane Michael. So it's very limited parking around that boat ramp area. You would need to go early probably if you're going to get a spot there for your trailer. There's no access beyond the Eagle Harbor boat ramp area in St. Joe because it looks like this now. This is an area in the peninsula that used to have a road going to the far end of St. Joe State Park. And that completely blew out during Hurricane Michael. It's now starting to actually fill in gradually with sand from natural processes. And the state is also working on that to try to reconnect the rest of the park so you can access that. In Franklin County, there's a smaller area for harvesting scallops, but in some years it can be a very good area. Generally, the populations aren't as high there from what I've seen as you'll find and as consistent as you'll find in St. Joseph Bay. The area is called St. George Sound, and it's the part of St. George Sound over towards the Lanark Village community in Franklin County. There are very few places you can actually put in that are close to this scalloping area. That light blue area is kind of out in the middle of nowhere to the east of Carabel. So one of the primary places that people launch to look for scallops in that area is a private boat ramp at the Lanark Village Boat Club. There's a minimal $10 fee, and it's very close to the places that people generally find scallops in Franklin County there. There are several ramps in Carabel, actually, various private ramps and city ramps. Launch fees will vary, but those ramps are going to be about 6 miles away by water to that primary scallop harvesting area. In Wakulla County, the main area people go scalloping is along the shore in the shallow areas off of the St. Mark's National Wildlife Refuge. And it's a beautiful area there. Just to the left of that light blue shaded area is where the St. Mark's Lighthouse is located out on that point, and that is within the refuge. So that's the closest place to launch to access this area. But again, you need to be careful for, in this area particularly, oyster bars are very common, and you need to navigate in marked channels. That's the only place where it's safe to really be running on top of the water at high speeds in very well marked channels. Otherwise, you better really be careful where you're going out in these areas. There are several places you can launch. Most of them are not as close as the Wildlife Refuge access ramp there. That ramp in the National Wildlife Refuge is a really nice, big, wide double ramp. And all you have to do is pay that fee to come into the refuge. I think it's $6 now. I had $5 listed there from one source. Best place to access that area. Shell Point has a couple of places. There's a boat ramp that is a public ramp in Shell Point community that's about 9 miles by water. Another one near Shell Point is the Blue Dolphin Way public boat ramp, and it's about 9 miles away. And the city of St. Mark's is also about 9 miles, but most of that is traveling in a marked channel in the St. Mark's River as it comes out near the lighthouse at the refuge there. But probably about 9 miles by water to launch from St. Mark's public boat ramp or the Shields Marina private ramp there in the town of St. Mark's. Let's talk about a few general harvesting regulations. And I want to emphasize general because if you want details, and you need details to be sure you're following all of the rules, you need to go to the FWC website to get all of that information in a very detailed way. For our area, Jen will talk a little bit about seasons around the area too, I believe, in her presentation. We have two different seasons. St. Joseph Bay in Gulf County has a shorter season than the rest of our region that we harvest scallops in Wakulla and Franklin County typically. August 16th is the start date for St. Joe Bay, runs through September 24th. And then as you come east from there and get into Franklin County from St. Vincent Island, all the way down to the middle of Taylor County, the season opens earlier, July 1st, and runs through September 24th. Limits are 2 gallons of scallops in the shell per person or 1 pint of shucked meat per person. And the maximum that you can harvest per any vessel out there in the area is 10 gallons or 4 pints of shucked meat in the shell, in the vessel, or in the shell. I'm sorry, 4 pints of shucked meat per vessel. And the vessel limit does not let you exceed your limit per person. So if you had 6 people on a vessel, you could only harvest 10 gallons rather than 12 gallons. If you had 3 people on a vessel, you could only harvest 6 gallons instead of the 10 maximum per vessel. So you need to stay within that limit per person. You can harvest by hand, or you can use a dip net to pick up scallops off of the bottom. No dragging equipment or dredging equipment or anything like that allowed. You are actually allowed to harvest scallops with a no-cost shoreline license if you wade from shore and you are not snorkeling or using scuba gear in the water to find them. And also if you didn't have to swim to get to the area where you're harvesting scallops. But if you have to swim to get over to an area where scallops are, or you take a vessel to go to that area, you do have to have a saltwater fishing license unless you are exempt by age or some other provision within the law for license requirements. If you go to the website at fwc.com/boating, this is a great place to find all of the information you need regarding boating and operator requirements. These 3 boxes on the left side, boating regulations, boating safety and education, and Florida Boat Ramp Finder are the places where you can get pretty much all the information that applies to your scalloping trip out on these waters. So a lot of good information, detailed information there. Here's some general boating safety regulations. And again, these are much more complex than what we're able to talk about tonight, but in general, I'll talk about a few things. Go to the fwc.com/boating website for detailed boating and safety rules. There are actually different safety gear requirements for different size classes of vessels. Most of the vessels that you see in scalloping areas are smaller motor vessels, probably not any larger than the 20 to 25 foot size range, because bigger vessels are difficult to take into these shallow areas without causing damage to the seagrass habitat or running aground. Safety gear is required on those vessels. You need to have your fire extinguishers and your flares and life jackets according to the rules for your vessel size, because FWC officers do come into the scalloping areas and do check for safety equipment and gear on boats during the scallop season. You need to make sure your registration is up to date as well. Operators do have requirements. If you are operating a motor vessel in Florida with a 10 horsepower or greater motor on it, you are required, unless exempt, to have a boater safety course card on your person if you were born after 1987. So from January 1st, 1988 till now, anybody in that range, if you are not exempt for a special reason within these rules, and there's a list of exemptions, you would be required to have a boater safety card showing that you passed this boater safety course that you can take online. Divers down flag requirements are really important. And those are some of the things that I see violated quite a bit in scalloping areas. People are not really paying attention to the rules related to divers down flags. If you're on a vessel, you have to have a flag that is 20 by 24 inches, and it has to be displayed from the highest point on the vessel. It can't be tied to an anchor light that's down on the stern of the boat. It needs to be tied so it's visible from above the entire vessel so it can be seen from all directions. If you are just floating or swimming and carrying a float with a dive flag on it, it's only required to be 12 by 12. But all of these flags are required to have a wire stiffener so that even if the wind isn't blowing, that flag stays erect so people can see it. This is another one where I see problems where people don't really follow the rules related to speeds and operation of vessels around divers down flags. You are required to slow your vessel to idle when you are within 300 feet in open water, or within 100 feet if you are in a river or a channel or an inlet. So you must come off of plane and slow your boat down to an idle speed. If you are swimming in the water around a diver, you but they are. That's imperative. And if you're out there without a vessel near you, you definitely have to have a flag that is on a float that is tethered to you, that goes with you. All right, that's all the information I wanted to throw at you there. Go to those websites that FWC maintains for very detailed rules and regulations. Okay, I am going to introduce our next speaker. We're going to get ready to hear from Dr. Savannah Berry. Savannah is a regional specialized agent with Florida Sea Grant. She is actually located at the Nature Coast Biological Station down in Cedar Key. And Savannah's going to talk to us about seagrasses, biology, and safe boating practices in seagrasses to protect that incredible habitat that bay scallops depend on. Savannah?
All right, great. Thanks so much, Eric. And yeah, all those rules are super important. I've always heard from FWC officers that the divers down flag is probably the most common violation they see. So make sure you study up on those rules. But I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about one of my favorite things, which is seagrass. And I know that out of this picture, you guys are probably most interested in the two scallops sticking out of that seagrass. But all that green stuff around the scallops is why we find the scallops where we find them. And seagrass is just vital habitat for lots of different things, scallops included, and it's what I spent a lot of time in graduate school studying. And this is what we like to see, a nice, beautiful, dense meadow of seagrass with scallops nestled all in there like Easter eggs. Just a little bit about seagrass to start off. These are plants that live fully submerged in salt water. So these aren't the marsh grasses that are sticking up above the water as we're boating out the channel. These are the seagrasses that live fully submerged on those soft, muddy bottoms throughout Florida. And there's two main species that dominate and form big meadows. We actually have 7 species of seagrass in Florida, but manatee grass, the top right one there, and turtle grass, the bottom right one, are the two main ones that form dominant meadows, and primarily where we find a lot of scallops. They're actually fully flowering plants. They're not related to the grass that's in your yard. They're more closely related to lilies, but that picture right there is a picture of a seagrass flower. It's quite a pretty little flower, and they flower at the base. So seagrass does not like to be mowed like the grass in your lawn does. So, and we're going to cover a little bit more about that. But what seagrasses do like is a lot of light reaching the bottom. So they need really good, clear water. And they like shallow areas where plenty of light reaches the bottom, and anything that clouds up the water is going to make it tough for them to survive. So some ecological functions, I put a baby scallop there attached to a seagrass blade. When they settle out, they actually like to attach to seagrass blades for short periods of time with little threads. But seagrasses provide habitat for many, many, many more species. The general sort of rule of thumb that we throw out is about 85% of our recreationally and commercially important species spend at least some part of their life cycle in seagrass. They depend on it. So they're really an important part of the puzzle out there in our estuaries. Seagrasses also make it a lot nicer for us when we're snorkeling around and searching for scallops. They're able to trap and stabilize sediments with their leaves and that root system that I mentioned before, and that makes the water much clearer and makes it easier and safer for us to swim around and hunt for those little Easter eggs, like I said before. They also do a lot of other things. They put a lot of oxygen into the water, and that helps all of those critters that live in the seagrass to survive and do better. And there are some of our favorite megafauna species like manatees and turtles actually do graze directly on the seagrass, so they serve as a food source. And beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but I find them to be quite beautiful, and they add a nice element, a nice pretty green meadow out there in the water. So we have lots of seagrass in Florida. We're really lucky. It's part of the reason why we have such great fishing in Florida. So we have most of the seagrass in the United States. We actually have the 2 largest seagrass meadows in the US. And the biggest one is down in Florida Bay in the Keys, but the best one is up here in the Big Bend and the Nature Coast, because we have scallops in our seagrass here. And that is one of the reasons why we have such a great scallop fishery is because we have such extensive seagrass meadows in this area. So unfortunately, seagrass is some of the most threatened habitats that we have. We're losing seagrass at a rapid rate globally and also in many areas in Florida, unfortunately. And the leading reason that we're losing seagrass is actually because of degraded water quality, which again blocks out light. So I said before that seagrasses need a lot of light to survive. So anything that increases turbidity or silt in the water, or anything like nutrient enrichment that fuels algal blooms that we are unfortunately all too familiar with in Florida, that's the leading threat to seagrass. But another major threat to seagrass that is definitely not a small one and should not be ignored is physical damage through prop scars and anchor drags and things like that. And there's a picture, of course, of that on the bottom right there, an all too familiar sight. And Eric pointed out that a lot of these areas in Wakulla and Franklin, and actually throughout the entire Big Bend, have very challenging navigation, very shallow areas, lots of big grass flats, and it's really easy to find yourself in a situation where you are creating one of those prop scars. There are other threats to seagrass, but we're not going to cover them here in the interest of time. But just keep in mind that seagrass is definitely in need of our thought and protection. So I wanted to take a closer look at this issue so you guys can see what it looks like from above. And this is just a screen grab from Google Earth, but it's kind of hard to see depending on your screen resolution. So what I've done here is traced out all of the scars, and this is only a 9-acre area. That's really not that big of an area. You can see, you know, for scale, here's 100 feet, and then there's a boat driving through here, actually actively creating a prop scar. There's a big prop wash behind him. It's kind of interesting that Google Earth captured that. But just in this 9-acre area, we have 2,600 linear feet of scars. And that's a huge problem because each linear foot, if you were to go out and do a restoration program to put this back how it was, it would could cost up to $40,000 just to restore scars in this one small area. And this is off of Taylor County near Steenhatchee. And as of 1995, which is now becoming more and more outdated, we had about 173,000 scarred acres of seagrass in Florida. And all in all, if we were to restore all of that by hand, which we would never do because it would be way too much work, but if we were, it would be $5.6 billion to restore that. And meanwhile, we're losing a lot of services related to all of that lost acreage of seagrass. That's just caused basically by things that are preventable that we can, as boaters, can do just a little bit more to have some thought to seagrass. So other than the financial cost of the seagrass loss, scars take a long time to heal. And while the scars are healing, if they even are able to heal naturally, the seagrass is just less resilient. If we have storms come through, they can erode away more area. Those scars can even actually expand over time rather than heal. So it's just not a good thing. You know, the old saying, death by 1,000 cuts, this really does apply in the situation to seagrass scarring. And it can also cause costly damage to your boating equipment. It can be not a fun day on the water if you run aground or bend a prop or something, and then you have to limp back to the boat ramp, and then you've got some costly repairs. And I find scars to be quite ugly. Again, it's all a matter of opinion, but they're really not. It's kind of makes you bummed out when you see them out there on the water. Okay, so just as a boater, what can you do to be seagrass safe? There's 3 main things. The first is to just avoid seagrass when possible. Eric mentioned using those marked channels. So stick to your marked channels, invest in a good chart, understand the depths, and also plan your trip around the tides so that you know when low tide is, so you know when you can be extra careful around that window. If you do find yourself over seagrass, like if you're heading into the scalloping grounds after navigating out of the channel, trim up your motor or even use your trolling motor if you're over shallow seagrass. And if you start to see mud and like tips of leaves and things be churned up, that's a surefire sign that you're touching the bottom and you need to slow down even more and trim up even more. And if you find yourself totally aground on seagrass, the best thing to do is turn off your motor, put on some water shoes or something to protect your feet, and get in the water and push your boat back into a deeper operable water depth. If you try to use your motor, again, it gets into the possibility that you're going to damage your motor, but also if you try to power off when you're aground on a seagrass flat, you can actually cause, instead of just a scar, you can cause what's called a blowout. And that's a really deep hole that is caused by these, you know, basically revving your motor and blowing out a big hole in the seagrass. And that will never heal on its own. And that costs even more than what I was saying before to restore. So please don't be the person that causes a big blowout. Please push. And sometimes you may even get in a situation where you need to wait for the tide to come back up so that you can float off if you're too far away to push. So again, just know your tides and plan your day around the tides so you don't find yourself in that situation. Much of this area is all an aquatic preserve, especially off of the St. Mark's area. So in addition to all the other things we already talked about, there is also a law that can lead to having a fine of up to $1,000 for damaging seagrass within an aquatic preserve. All right, so a couple actions you can take today, and I think we're going to be putting a couple links in the chat box. You can take the Seagrass Safe Boating Pledge. It's just a little reminder, you know, kind of just set the stage for your summer of scalloping, that you're going to make sure that you keep seagrass in mind if you take the pledge. And then there's also a Star Scalloper Pledge that you can take, which is to basically just remind yourself about all of the best practices, some of which Eric talked about the boating safety and all of that. And you can find more information about that in a lot of our Florida Sea Grant web resources that we have for you. So check out those links that are going to be coming up in the chat. And thank you so much for your time and attention for seagrass. And please definitely have questions. Feel free to put them in the Q&A box about anything that we've covered so far or anything that we haven't covered. We'd love to have your questions piling up there for when we finish. All right, and now I'm going to pass over the floor to Eric so that he can introduce our next speaker.
Thank you, Savannah. Our next speaker is going to be Dr. Jennifer Grameen. Jen is an associate research scientist at the Florida Fish and Wildlife Research Institute located down in St. Petersburg, Florida. And Jen does work on scallops all around our area and has been involved with a program that some of our Sea Grant faculty have been working with the FWC on also, to actually get the public involved in doing some restoration work with scallops. So she may talk a little bit more about that. And her topic tonight is bay scallop biology and ecology. And I'm looking forward to hearing what Jen has to share with us.
Great, thank you for that introduction, Eric. As he mentioned, I'll be covering a little bit about bay scallop biology, the fishery, and some of the regulations as well. And I'm the lead biologist for the state scallop program with FWRI. Okay, the bay scallop, Argopecten irradians, is a bivalve. And what that means is that it has two valves or shells. The top shell is usually a dark color, while the bottom shell is normally a white or a light color. And one of the first things you'll probably notice about scallops if you go out scalloping are the really bright blue eyes around the rim of the shell. And scallops can have up to 40 or more of these blue eyes that help them to detect predators and movement. So when you're out scalloping, another thing that you'll notice right away is that, as I mentioned, they use those, they will very rapidly swim away from you when you're going to try to catch them when you're scalloping, which makes it a little bit more fun and challenging. And they do this by rapidly clapping their shells together to move through the water. This is what a scallop looks like when you open it up. They're hermaphrodites, which means that they have both male and female reproductive organs, which you can see here. And generally, most scallops will die after they reproduce or spawn. And so they typically live for only about 1 to 2 years in Florida. They reach a maximum shell height of around 3.5 inches, but really here in Florida, you probably won't find scallops bigger than 2.5 to 3 inches. And another interesting thing about scallops is that unlike oysters or clams, where you eat the entire organism. The only part of the scallop that most people eat is the adductor muscle. All right, so we conduct dive surveys to measure the density of scallops at sites, counting the number of scallops we encounter while diving, and measuring the shell heights of those scallops. So in the past, we've conducted these surveys throughout the areas open to scalloping prior to the season opening in each of those areas. The graph that I'm showing you here contains the data from those pre-season surveys from 2012 to 2019 throughout the open areas. However, this year we're doing things a bit differently, and we're going to switch to conducting surveys after the scallop season closes instead of prior to the opening of the scallop season. And one of the reasons we're doing this is because, as I mentioned earlier, scallops spawn in the fall, and that's typically after the scallop season closes each year. So by sampling in the fall, we can actually evaluate the scallops that are still available to spawn, which directly supports the fishery the following year. And then the data that we collect in the fall can show us larger trends over time that may indicate changes in stock, and that's going to be useful for assessing the health and the resiliency of the population over time. All right. So this year there are 4 main zones that each have different season start and end dates. And since we're focusing on Franklin through Taylor County here, just going to talk about that. So the season in Franklin through Northwest Taylor County opens on July 1st, and it closes on September 24th this year. And as Eric mentioned, that region includes all state waters from the westernmost point of St. Vincent Island in Franklin County to Rock Island near the mouth of the Fen Holloway River in Taylor County. So that includes, as Eric mentioned, Carabel, Lanark, St. Marks. One thing that we do ask is that you don't discard scallop shells in inshore waters. And that's because that can create a hazard for recreational activities because it creates piles of those shells. And it can damage seagrass habitat as well. So we ask that you discard scallop shells in the trash instead, or you can bring them home with you and do fun arts and crafts projects with them if you want. All right, I'm not going to go into too much detail here because Eric covered most of this. This is the daily bag limit for the region. There are no size limits, but we do recommend that you throw back smaller scallops. Firstly, because you're not going to get much meat from the small scallops. And also, by throwing back the small scallops, you give them a chance to spawn before being harvested. And harvest is permitted by hand or by using a landing or dip net. You can scuba dive or snorkel to harvest scallops. And as Eric mentioned, you do need a saltwater fishing license, unless you're exempt for some reason from needing a license, or you can use that no-cost shore license, but your feet cannot leave the bottom to harvest scallops if you're using that. One relatively new regulation is that you can transport legally harvested scallops through closed areas, but boaters can't stop their vessels in waters that are closed to harvest and must proceed directly to the dock or to the ramp to land scallops in a closed area. And then one last thing is that I just wanted to take a moment to clarify the gallon limits for bay scallops because I've seen a lot of confusion about this when I'm interacting with scallopers. So for most 5-gallon buckets, like the kind that you would get from Home Depot, which you can see here, the 5-gallon mark is not actually at the top of the bucket, but it's really closer in some cases to the bucket handle. So in this picture, these scallopers would have collected more than their 10-gallon limit. You can buy some 5-gallon buckets that have marks delineating the volume of each gallon in the bucket. But if your bucket doesn't have this, then I recommend taking a gallon jug, fill it with water, and dump the gallons into your bucket so that you can mark out where the gallon line is and the 5 gallon line is on your bucket. But don't just assume that the 5 gallons is to the very top of the bucket. And so with that, I wish you all happy scalloping and good luck.
Okay. Thank you so much, Jen. We appreciate that. And we will introduce our next and last speaker. Dr. Razia Farzad is an assistant professor and seafood scientist. And Razia is located in Gainesville at University of Florida's Department of Food Science and Human Nutrition. She is one of our newest team members to join the University of Florida. And we're really happy to have her talking with us tonight about the topic of scallop handling practices for food safety. Thank you, Razia. Go ahead.
Thank you, Eric, for introducing me, and thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. As Eric said, I'm going to talk a little bit about some handling practices to make sure that a scallop is a safe food to eat. Oops, sorry. Okay, so basically, if we want to make sure that a scallop is a safe seafood, we want to follow some strategies to control the pathogens and biotoxin. And the strategies include practicing personal hygiene, proper handling and shocking practices, and following the storing and cooking recommendations that are out there for us. So, for controlling the pathogen, the basic most important practice is to make sure that it's personal hygiene and washing our hands. And I think we are living at the time in the middle of pandemic that everyone has heard how important it is to follow the proper hand washing technique to control the spread of techniques. And I'm sure everyone is following the technique, but I'll go over it one more time to make sure that everyone knows about that. So proper hand washing technique, you should wet your hand with warm water, lather it with soap, and scrub your hand together for at least 20 seconds. Make sure that you are cleaning between your fingers, your thumb, and your wrist. Also, you need to make sure that all the utensils, all the cleaning tools, all the surfaces that you are using to clean the scallops are first clean. There is no dirt on them, and they are sanitized. So you should make sure that they are washed with detergent and soap. And if you are doing the scalloping with people that are not living with you, I highly recommend to wear the personal protective equipment or PPE that is recommended by WHO and CDC under these circumstances, which is wearing mask and, if possible, keep your physical distance. Other strategies for control of the pathogens and biotoxin. Usually for other shellfish, we say make sure that the shellfish is harvested from the water source that has been controlled for bacteria and biotoxin, but waters that we are harvesting a scallop from, they are not being tested for any of those things. So main thing that we can do for control of the pathogen is control of the temperature as soon as you harvest the scallop. So as soon as you harvest the scallop, you should keep them on ice at 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and you can easily put them in the cooler on top of the rice, and you can maybe put a moist towel in between the scallop and the ice to decrease to actually control the thermal shock that kill the scallop right away. Of course, we don't care about if a scallop is dead or alive, but if we can increase the storage of lifetime, we can reduce the pathogen growth. Temperature cannot control the biotoxin high or low, but fortunately, we only consume adductor or white muscle of a scallop, but there is no evidence that there is biotoxin in those white muscles. So if you follow the effective shocking and cleaning practices, if you make sure that all the traces of gut and gonad that they actually contain the biotoxin are removed, and if you rigorously wash the white mussel, make sure that there is no cross contact between the gut content than the edible flesh, you are also safe in regard to the biotoxic contamination. Some storing recommendation. So as I said, on the boat to the shore, you should make sure that the scallop is being kept at 40 degrees Fahrenheit. But as soon as you arrive home, you should keep the scallop in the refrigerator at 40 degrees Fahrenheit until you want to use it. Fresh scallop can be used or stored in a fridge for up to 2 days, but ideally we recommend that you consume it within 1 day. Do not store your scallops in water. If you want to use it later for extended shelf life, put this in the freezer at 0 degrees Fahrenheit or less. You can easily put it in an airtight container and put the container in the freezer. To thaw the scallops, you should always put it the day before in the fridge. We recommend not to thaw any kind of seafood in room temperature because the bacteria at the surface is going to start to grow while in the middle of the food is still frozen. Also, if you cook the scallop and you don't want to eat it right away, just make sure if the degree of your house is above 90, you have to consume it within 1 hour. If it's lower than 90, you have 2 hours to consume the scallop. So FDA usually have some internal cooking temperature that recommends for a different kind of protein. For a scallop, there is no internal cooking temperature. You should just eyeball and make sure that the scallop's color is changing to white or opaque, and it usually takes 3 to 5 minutes. So basically, if you control the time and the temperature that you are storing your scallop, make sure that you are following all the cleaning recommendation, you can be safe that you can be sure that your scallop is safe to eat. So enjoy your scallop.
Thank you, Razia. We appreciate that very much.
So at this point, we'll ask everyone that's joining us on Zoom to go ahead and take a poll that should be popping up for you. If you're on a smartphone or tablet, it might not, but just take a second and go through those quick questions there, and we'll give you a minute to answer those before we move on to the Q&A. And meanwhile, once you finish the poll, feel free to type a question into the Q&A. We have some great experts here to take questions about it, all things scalloping.
So I'll go ahead and leave the poll up a little longer. We could probably go ahead right now. We just have one question that's come in, and we can go ahead and get started with that one. And while we're waiting on for some of the other people to go ahead and complete the survey, this question would be for Jennifer. And so the question came from actually St. Johns County, and the question was, why don't we have the same dates for the season in each county? Why is it different in different areas throughout Florida?
Okay, thank you for that question. Good question. The FWC Commission sets different season start and end dates and regulations in each of the zones that I mentioned based on balancing stakeholder interests with recommendations from biologists like me that study the resource. So the Division of Marine Fisheries Management will accept public comment during public workshops in each of these zones to consider what the season length should be, and then we provide recommendations based on the biology in each of these areas as well. So for instance, in St. Joe Bay, the population was recovering from a red tide for a period of time, and so we had a recommendation of a shorter season, and that was balanced with stakeholder interest as well. So it's region specific depending on the resource and stakeholder interests.
All right, thank you, Jen. I appreciate that. We could probably talk a little bit about scallop sitters since we have a little bit of time, and maybe the restoration of scallops as a whole. The Scallop Sitters program we've done here in Bay County and also in Gulf County the last 2 years, and this year was interrupted by the pandemic, and so we've kind of been working our way through that. But it's an exciting program, and it's a good way to kind of get some people involved in restoration, and it fits well with what FWC is doing. You want to kind of talk to people a little bit about that, and I'll also, you know, go ahead and post our emails for me and Ray and Eric, so that people in different regions that might be listening or watching this later can go ahead and contact us.
Sure, yeah, I love talking about that program. We began restoring scallops in the Panhandle region in 2016 following that red tide event, as I mentioned, and the work is funded by a natural resource damages assessment grant. We started by placing cages of scallops out in the bay. By placing scallops in cages, it puts the scallops in close proximity, which increases the fertilization success of the scallops when they spawn, and potentially increases the stock the following year. In 2018, we began our Scallop Sitter program that Scott mentioned. And in that program, which we've partnered with Sea Grant on, we distribute cages and scallops to volunteers that are interested in helping us to restore the scallops in St. Joseph Bay and St. Andrew Bay, which is where we started. So we've been running that program for a couple years now, and we were planning on expanding it to St. George Sound this year, but as Scott mentioned, unfortunately, due to concerns over COVID, we've had to postpone that this year, but we are planning on continuing that restoration effort next year. We also host scallop rodeos where people can go and collect scallops on designated days from the bays that we're trying to restore, and we place those in scallop restoration cages as well. So if you want more information about that, I'm happy to share the website.
Jennifer, are we going to postpone the scallop rodeos this year also, or is that going to be okay?
Yes, those are also postponed this year, sadly.
And I placed a link to your main page in the chat, but we can go ahead and put some of those other pages that you have broken out on that page in there as that are more specific to the Scallop Sitters program too. We do have a few more questions that have come in, and so one more would be just how much impact do the hurricanes have on scalloping and also red tide, and what would be the impact of COVID-19? And I'll let Jennifer start, and if anybody else has a answer to maybe the last part of that, that would be great.
Sorry, and that was directed to me, right, Scott?
Yes, go ahead and start with you, and then we'll talk to Rasia.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so the impact of Hurricane Michael, for instance, came through St. Joe, affected St. Joe, St. Andrew, St. George. We did actually notice an increase in the scallop population in St. Joe following the hurricane, which was, it could have been related to the break in the inlet that was created that Eric showed the picture of earlier. And it could have also been related to the restoration work that I mentioned that's been ongoing in that area. Red tide certainly has a very negative and documented effect on scallops, especially scallop larvae and settling scallop juveniles. So red tide and scallops really don't mix very well. And was there another part of that question?
COVID-19, I don't know how you feel about that. Certainly it's affected the research.
Yeah, it's negatively affected our ability to get out there and do our surveys and to do our scallop sitter program and our scallop rodeos as well. But we are continuing our scallop restoration efforts. We continue to place scallops in our restoration cages, and those are collected from the wild and from our hatchery that we partner with as well. In terms of the effect on the resource, I'm not sure what that might be. If less people decide to go scalloping, then there might be an effect on the resource, I suppose.
So again, maybe think about it. Savannah, was that you?
Yeah, Scott, I just wanted to add that on our last webinar, we had a captain that was a panelist, and we didn't have one this time. But for the COVID-19, if you are going to charter a captain to go scalloping with, it would be a good idea to just ask what sanitation procedures they're using for their gear, because most captains would provide you with mask and snorkel and things like that. So I just wanted to make sure that everybody thought about that if they did want to book with a charter captain. Yeah.
Rasia, did you have anything else to add?
I just like to follow up with Savannah. I agree with her. The impact on us, it's like only depend on us, because the only way that we have right now to control this is washing our hands, sanitize everything, make sure that we are wearing masks. And there are many unknown, to be honest, how this affects our seafood industry in general. But to protect yourself, just follow the rules that are out there. Take them serious.
All right, Eric, that's all we have right now. And I think the panelists for what they've done, I think everybody's done a great job.
We had a new one come in just now.
All right. Where is that? Okay, how has the catch been so far in the counties that have been open? And I guess, Jennifer, do you have any results or any thoughts on that?
Hi, thank you for your question. So as I mentioned in my presentation, this year we have switched from doing our pre-season surveys, which we've historically done, to moving to a post-season survey structure. So what that means is that we haven't gotten out there yet to measure the density of the scallops. So I can't comment on what the density or abundance of the scallops is in those areas that have been open to scalloping yet. And I haven't heard from captains or anyone out there what it's been like yet.
All right, thank you so much. Savannah, you're a little closer to that.
Yeah. I've heard that that things in Steenhatchee are maybe a little below normal, but that folks aren't having too hard of a time finding them. But the comments have been pretty normal, like you would expect. They're a little bit smaller this time of year and things like that. I have heard some early indications that maybe in the south of us, in Crystal River area and Homosassa, isn't as good inshore, but they're seeing them in deeper water, and that's all I've heard so far. So it seems to be kind of a mixed bag at the moment. So I guess it still remains to be seen.
Jen, we did have another question. How did Pasco County do in 2019? Do we have any thoughts there?
Sure, yeah, Pasco County, in comparison to some of the other counties, was at a relatively higher level compared to, for instance, Homosassa or some of the other areas. And I'm happy to share the link to that bay scallop season and abundance graph that I shared with the group, so that you can look at how the data has varied over time. There's a great deal of variability in scallop densities from one year to the next.
All right, we'll look at that. I know you sent me another message a minute ago with a web link in that. I'll try to get that up in just a second to make that happen. I'll go ahead and share with you the results. We certainly appreciate you being with us and looking at and learning about some of the things that you can do to help both scallops and also the resources that provide us with scallops with seagrasses. So I really do appreciate you participating in the poll results as well. And I'll try to get those web links up that Jennifer sent to me so that everybody can get those. And Savannah or Eric, if you want to take over while I do that, that would be great.
I just wanted to mention one last thing Scott didn't talk about during the best practices section. And for dive flags, just remember to take them down when you're underway. That's a big thing that people forget, and then they're running on plane with their dive flag up. That's actually a really common violation. So try to remember to take that dive flag and stow it when you're driving. I think that's just the one last best practice that did not get mentioned.
Yeah, and just reiterating, watch the tides. Pick the right tide to go scalloping on, because a lot of those areas in St. Joe Bay and St. Mark's Refuge area, you can have seagrass tops of blades actually on the surface of the water on low tides in those areas that you could scallop on a high tide. If you go on a low tide and try to get into those areas with a boat, it's going to be problems. And Savannah mentioned you can damage your equipment. I've seen that happen where boats would have grasses that would get over the intake for the water cooling system on the lower unit of an outboard motor and cause a motor to overheat and cause serious damage. So it's better to just keep that foot out of the seagrasses.
All right, I think we're about ready to wrap up if we don't have any more questions. Savannah, did you see anything else? I know there was some questions about somebody had their hand raised in the chat box or in the other window, but I think there wasn't.
Yeah, it looks like we handled that
Okay.
question. So I think we're in good shape to wrap up, and thanks everybody for your time and joining us.
I think so. Thank you so much. And we'll go ahead and end tonight. Thank you.